So please, Katalin, you may start.
Okay, thank you. So just very briefly, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, or good evening, depending where you are watching this. I'm Katalin Reszegi, and this is the second lecture in Onomastics Online, the online lecture series of the International Council of Onomastic Sciences. And I am here with Martin Thiering, who prepared an exciting lecture for us, and Przemysl Macha, if I pronounce it good, the chair of this session. I'm really sad that not much after the first lecture of this series, the war started in Ukraine and people are still suffering there. And I hope that by the time of our third lecture, there will be peace again. So that's all. And now, Przemysl Macha, please.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, and also thank you for the words of support for Ukraine. I think we're all struggling with accepting that something like that can happen in the 21st century in a pretty much neighboring country. My name is Przemysl Macha. You pronounced it really well, don't worry. I am from the Institute of Ethnology of the Czech Academy of Sciences. I'm interested in place naming and also how language structures our perception of the environment. And as an anthropologist, I tend to look at also non-European context. I did a little bit of study of the Athabascan speakers in New Mexico, Apaches and Navajos, and their place naming strategies. So I'm looking very much to the lecture that will be presented today by Dr. Martin Thiering. He is a researcher who has done research in cognitive linguistics, toponymy, both at present and in ancient Europe, has published extensively on the topic, is currently teaching at Aachen University and at the University of Berlin. As, and plus, I think he has an engagement or has been involved with the Max Planck Institute for Linguistics. So there has been he has been involved in many different fields and institutes. He's quite busy, so we are very happy that he has been able to find time for us and share some of his research on Athabascan speakers, which nevertheless I hope will be able to relate them to perhaps the context that we are more familiar with in our own countries or in our own research. Dr. Thiering mentioned that his talk would be about 45 minutes. After that, we will have time for questions and discussion. Please, if you want to raise a question, raise your hand, either on the computer or then if you turn on your video, wave your hand so we know that you want to speak. I know not everybody knows how to operate Zoom. I struggle with it every time. So one way or the other, let us know that you would like to pose a question, and then we'll accommodate you in an order as you sign up for the discussion. So that is all for me for now. I'll give the floor to Dr. Thiering and his interesting lecture.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. Indeed, thanks for showing up at all, and also for the kind words in the beginning. And of course, our thoughts go to the Ukrainian people. Indeed, that's of course easy for me to say sitting here north of Germany, I know, but yeah, what can I do? What I can do is hopefully not entertain you, but present a lecture that might be of interest to some or hopefully most of you. I guess I'll share my screen here. Hopefully you can see this in a minute. Give me a minute here. Is this okay to see? All right. I am, as you said rightfully, I'm a different institute. So I'm an associate professor at the Technical University since 2014. I'm always trying to present students some data from languages with a non-written culture. And so what I'm trying to do is my research foci is really spatial cognition, spatial language from this kind of new Wolfram approach, that is how languages might affect cognition and vice versa. At the Max Planck Institute for the Art History in Rome, to be correct, I am a research group leader on toponyms and landmarks in maps from the Renaissance and even before, and different texts, that's in Latin and Italian. If you have time, if you're interested, I might show you the computational tools we are using. Today, I am presenting toponyms and landmarks as cognitive maps. I would call them cognitive sketches in Dene Chipewyan and Eipomek, to very different areas, to different environments. And hopefully you'll see why this might be of interest to this series. So what's the focus basically? So I'm really interested in toponyms and landmarks as spatial concepts encoded in different modalities from a cross-linguistic perspective. And I'm also interested in exploring the degree to which environmental experience of landmarks and spatial orientation is reflected in language as toponyms. I'll talk about this in more detail in a minute. Just a quote here. The naming of geographic features as part of territorial marking orientation is a common occurrence in all cultures. Topographical names reflect specific cultural interests and historical developments within the possibilities given by the morphology of the language. So you can clearly see the connection here from geographic features to the morphology or morphosyntax indeed. They go on saying that if people choose to orient themselves to coasts or seas, rivers or mountains, the sun's path and whatnot, or some other features, some aspect of this will usually show up in their place names. Thing is, most of us actually use this little item here called, this is an iPhone or a smartphone. And nowadays you follow this one-dimensional dot, right? So you don't even really, you go to a different place, an unknown place. You're not really, you don't really have to acknowledge landmarks, surroundings. You can just follow this little thing. This has an impact upon spatial cognition. This is some research I'm doing in Aachen in VR environment, not the focus today, but this is already a crucial gadget in terms of affordances. One more quote, please. Don't worry, I don't have too many quotes here. Landmarks specifically are unique configurations of perceptual events. They identify a specific geographical location. A person's account of his or her spatial representation begins with the landmarks, and these landmarks are the strategic foci to and from which the person moves or travels. Landmarks are used as proximate course maintaining devices. Not only do they identify beginnings and endings, but also serve to maintain course. Now, this goes back to research on Micronesian cultures and navigating without nautical instruments, which is also very interesting. I did some work on that part as well. Again, a different presentation. But you can already tell I'm really interested in this kind of spatial navigation orientation. So let's go to the linguistic part here. I'm really interested in the morphosyntax semantics in these languages I'm presenting here. So in the linguistic representations of spatial concepts in topographical coordinates in Dene Chipewyan in Canada, Western Canada, and Eipomek spoken in the central mountains of the province of Papua New Guinea. The specific focus today is on linguistic representations of places, distances, scope, scale, perspective, and orientation, that is spatial frames of reference. I'm going to introduce them in a second. So both languages and cultures present specific environment-dependent encoding patterns mirrored partially in the language and oral traditions, but also in actual practices. Again, these are non-written cultures, so you cannot simply take a grammar, a novel or whatnot to figure out how people navigated in the past, how they used toponyms in the past. You have these myths and stories. That's a different kind of encoding knowledge, basically. We have very different environments. We have mountains in Nepal, specifically about 4,000 meters above sea level, and the river system in Dene. It's very important limitations serving as I call them topographical maps, kind of a cognitive or mental map. I'm just very careful with the term map. It introduces this kind of Western idea of a coordinate grid that might be a little bit too far-fetched here. These landmarks have repercussions clearly in the language patterns, in the morphosyntax, and how the speakers cover up spatial concepts. Another observation is different environmental experiences are represented in cultural practices, that is, house building, building traps or bridges, and via different semiotics of spaces that do indicate inter and intralingual cognitive differences. And language and practices or semiotic practices profile this, specify spatial concepts, that is, culture-specific cognitive maps. I'd like to add that I come from I did my PhD in Canada and my postdoc in the US. So I come from this cognitive linguistic culture, basically North America. So when I talk about profiling, that really means specifying via morphosyntactic pattern. Now, if I may, I'm going back to my home city, that is Hamburg. And I'm going to something you all know, I guess, how toponyms work usually. So you take an historical map and basically you know by the street names, the places, the different areas, how a city evolves and has changed, right? I mean, Hamburg is different because, of course, World War II kind of destroyed most of it, but you can still tell by the street names how the city basically evolved. Now you take different maps and you can compare it, and you take different stories and whatnot. I just come up with this very simple map here. I found it on Wiki Commons. So Hamburg stems from the idea of the semantic of Hammerburg. Hammer is kind of a ridge which goes into the marshland or into a forest. So Burg, of course, is castle. So you have this kind of compound where you can tell already, oh, this has been a vast area, basically, kind of a marshland before. And then you see nowadays different streets that refer back to old kind of limitations. That is Glacis, Chaussee, that's kind of a fortress, comes from French. You have große Bleichen, means basically places where people did bleach their clothing, basically. And you have Neuer und Alter Wall. Basically, it's a street I could actually focus in right now on the map directly, and you could see, oh, this is the new embankment and the old embankment. And of course, you find the oldest church there and whatnot. This is very typical from many European cities, basically. You have a market, a church, and you have surrounding basically streets and kind of these embankments, for example, right? And to the right, you, for example, see the street called Spitalstraße, which is the hospital street, which was, of course, outside of the walls of Hamburg, right? So you find in the name Hamburg the compound of castle, and that it has been a ridge that kind of moved into the marshland. You can also see this kind of fortress character if you take a larger map. So this is kind of materialized in the written system here, right? If you go back to another language and culture I worked on 30 years ago, actually, and that is Norwegian. So the capital is called Oslo, or Oslo, as you say in Norwegian, Oslo. And there has been quite some discussion where this name comes from. Luelva, that's kind of a river, but nowadays people would say, nah, maybe not, maybe. It actually comes from the idea that it's kind of a compound between us and lu, which is us or us is hill, and the lu part is under the hill, the plain under the hill. So if you take a map of Oslo or Oslo nowadays, you'll see it's surrounded by hills, basically. And this seems to be the origin of that toponym, right? Just as a started here, because it's getting a little bit more complicated, because again, the cultures and language I work on, they don't have these kind of materialized knowledge systems. So again, this is Eipomek for short, Eipo, and Dene for short, Dene Chipewyan, vice versa, sorry. They do present specific environmental dependent encoding patterns mirrored in the languages. You see this also in other languages, in Carrier, Hopi, Navajo, indeed, Hopi, Kuyukon, Slavi, Tlingit, and Apanekaksa Totonac spoken in Mexico. It's kind of it's a Mayan language I did some research on, and Yali. Now, I did some research on means. I took elicitation tools from the Max Planck Institute in Nijmegen based on video material or different questionnaires and interviews and whatnot. So basically you do field work. You go into the field, into the reserve, for example, of the prairies, and you really work with participants. That's what I did back in the days. Another argument, of course, is you do have those different landmarks, mountains and rivers and lakes. So you have the prairies, etc. and whatnot. And of course, these are important reference systems, right? Same for me in the city, right? Where I follow certain streets. In Rome, you have the Tiber, the river, kind of a limitation. You have the 7 hills, right? You have those landmarks, the buildings, of course. These are different areas. And the interesting part is how do you navigate there and how do toponyms actually help to navigate? And these reference systems actually show repercussions in the language patterns or morphosyntax and how they carve up spatial concepts. Another argument, of course, is that language, and now I define language as a written, oral, gesture, or whatever practice, kind of a multi-modal practice, is some kind of an external representation and it plays a double role. A, it throws light onto structures of cognition, and also in shaping cognition, influencing its structure. So I'm going back to really Wilhelm von Humboldt, Lev Vygotsky, and others, asking the question how language and cognition are related, right? I'm not going really into detail right now, but just to frame it a little bit. I'm starting from this kind of cognitive sketches background. This is Barbara Tversky in the early 1980s, and I kind of prefer this term as opposed to cognitive models or a cognitive map, going back to Tolman's experiments with rats. Again, a map is this kind of grid you apply from a Western perspective. But if you go to Micronesian cultures and orientation processes, they use quite some different encoding systems to navigate. And very often the idea of a map as a grid doesn't really help to understand the ways of navigation. So again, we have these cognitive sketches, so it's more coarse maybe, be shared as shared cognition from a cross-modal and cross-linguistic perspective. Descriptions of spaces, not places, right now spaces, so that's hora versus topos in Greek. So descriptions of spaces in language rest on 2 kinds of knowledge, at least. The first is based on cognitive sketches, as I just said, which people construct to guide spatial behavior, to get from A to B, right? So basically, you have a physical map and you double check, oh, I'm here, I want to get there, how do I do this? Oh, okay, I follow the road, or I take my compass system, or right now I would use this little gadget, the GPS. The second consists of a linguistic symbol system that allows these sketches to be shared within a community of discourse, right? So if I get asked, if a tourist asks me in Aachen, how do I get to place A, basically I can just, oh, let me think about it, and turn around, I might point to whatever direction and take certain reference points, right? Which is easy in these cities, but you see some examples where you might ask yourself, how do you orient yourself in these environments? So the agenda for today and in the past, basically, I want to figure out to investigate the complex interplay between environmental experience, via toponyms and landmarks, and spatial encoding processes as reflected in language and cultural practices. What do I mean by cultural practices? If I may, for a second, if you go work with EPO speakers and you ask them about to define a diameter or a square or a distance, so you use a Euclidean idea of a geometry, they basically look at you and don't know what you're talking about. But that does not mean that they don't know what a circle means, of course. It's in their culture practice. They have huts, they have round buildings, as you see in a minute. So I think this is really interesting to see how much is encoded in the language and how much is encoded as a culture practice. Some theory here. This is from my introduction, 2018, adapted from Stephen Levinson's work in 2003, Spatial Frames of Reference. This is important for research on the question language and cognition. I'm not going into too much detail here. We have 3 situations, and there are ample of theories and models parsing this kind of difference into different kind of coordinates. Levinson argues in terms of a tripartite structure. That is, we have an intrinsic frame of reference, a relative frame of reference, and an absolute frame of reference. What does it mean? You see on the bottom left, figure, ground, origin, and viewer. For now, you can translate the figure as being the subject, the ground being the object, going back to Gestalt theory, and the origin is basically who's taking what kind of perspective, right? And Immanuel Kant basically stated that all cultures universally endorse a relative frame of reference. But he didn't know anything about different cultures, apparently, because it's not that I always open up that the tree is to the left of the house, as you see in the middle. The tree is the figure, the smaller entity, and the reference point is the house, the ground. There are many cultures saying, and you can ask yourself, are you sitting in front of your laptop? If you sit in front of your laptop, the screen is kind of the intrinsic quality of that object, right? So you relate to that screen. So in the very first example, you see the tree is in front of the house. Although if you look at the example, it's not really in front, it's to the side. But the entrance now is the main reference point, right? And the absolute system, that's the most interesting one for today. That's the one where you basically orient yourselves according to cardinal directions, river systems, and whatnot landmarks. And it even goes to the detail that you might say that this glass is south of the laptop, which I wouldn't say in German or English, right? So it's independent of the human body. That's the important part here. So in those tests done by the Max Planck people, I'm not going into these tests today, but one example is you have a number of objects and you relate them. So you have to memorize them, you turn around, and then you have to kind of rephrase what you just did, how you memorized them. And basically you use left and right as a coordinate based on the human body on the axis. You turn around 180 degrees, left and right changes as well, of course. If you have an absolute system based on the cardinal direction or upriver, downriver, that system does not change if you turn 180 degrees. And of course, this has its advantages in different environments, right? This is some kind of different research I'm really working on right now in computer games, but this really comes from cognitive anthropology. And this is from my introduction in German cognitive anthropology and cognitive semantics in 2018. Now, let's go to the 2 languages and cultures that focus today. One is spoken in Western Papua New Guinea, as I said, about 4,000 meters above sea level. Until the early 1980s, you could just get there by helicopter, basically, or by actually parachuting. And most of this research has been done by Wolf Schiefenhöfer at the Max Planck Index and Volker Heschen. They were actually also in my so-called Habilitationscommittee in 2014, and I worked with them extensively at the Max Planck for the history of science in Berlin for a couple of years. So they are really the expert here, not me. Now you have a photograph here and you can tell already, okay, this is an interesting area. You can just ask yourself, how do you orient yourself? And you see a little hut there, about 300 people living there, round houses, and all those trees, rocks, and whatnot do present spatial orientation systems based on toponyms. That's the important, interesting part here. You would be lost completely. Even this little thing wouldn't help you at all. You need specific kind of very detailed knowledge here. And I mean, you just get the idea. If you're in the mountains here, how do you orient yourself? The speakers really parse up these environments very detailed in terms of the linguistic carving up, right? And they use those absolute systems. So relating on the human body in terms of orientation doesn't really help you here at all. Now we have the mountains. You have this very dense system of toponyms, right? And here again, just repeating, you see again the landscape. And I really like this idea of an, let's say, different environment. Very short overview. I'm not going into the detailed linguistic detail here, but just to give you an idea. SUV order, compounding is main source to denote word meaning, nouns not inflected and not morphological marked. That's enough. Now we go to Dene Chipewyan. Two nice pictures, postcard pictures, of course. You see the prairies, you see the mountains, you see lakes, right? And you see the historic and former hunting area. And it stretched quite a distance, as you can tell, right? From the Hudson Bay in the east to the north, basically Yellowknife. So it's quite a distance. And actually, hunters could orient themselves without actually a problem back in the days, I have to say. Now, I know this is a very nasty picture I just show you here. I'm sorry that I do this. This is the postcard picture. You might all think, oh, this is beautiful, and it is beautiful. Unfortunately, this is reality. Reality means I worked in Western Canada at the University of Alberta, and the reserve is in Cold Lake. Yes, Cold Lake, the name is basically, the lake is cold. And First Nation people live on the reserve. And I think you heard the news in the past years, more and more stories show up that these people in the 50s and 60s got basically tortured, to be very blunt here and straightforward, and the land has been taken away. That is all the ancestors' knowledge that is by toponyms is gone. Why? To the left, you see the world's second largest oil sand field, and it's Canada's largest military base, hence the airplane there in Cold Lake. So if you enter Cold Lake, that's what you see to the right there. Well, sorry to give you this impression, but this is reality. This is basically a map. You can go into more detail, but you see already some names popping up. Slavey Lake here, Lac La Bliche, Cold Lake to the right there. So you see already kind of the river system. Basically, this is basically the former hunting area of the Dene Chipewyan people. I just took a Google map, very simple, and then I typed in some toponyms like Kishare Uthine, and what does it mean? Downstream they dwell, and what does it mean? It's placed in the west, southwest of Great Slavey Lake, which is point A. It goes to near to the mouth of Hay River at sea, along Mackenzie River, Ticho, and it's about 1,738 kilometers long, and to Light River. Why is this interesting? Those toponyms, of course, are very specific for that area, and for especially the elder generation, they exactly know where they are located based on these toponyms. Oh, this one is I mixed it up. This one is, just forget about it. I have to redo this because, of course, this is EPO, which I just presented. Sorry about that part. We go to Dene here, sorry. This is SUV word order. What is interesting in Dene, it's a polysynthetic language. And that's kind of not really common for most linguists working on Germanic languages, for example. It's not inflective. Inflective is not agglutinative. Basically, what we call a sentence is just looks like a word in Dene. It's very, it's interesting to parse into morphemes, to put it more politely here. It's interesting, close, actually very similar to Navajo. It's rich classificatory verb system. What does this mean? It encodes qualitative features of the figure depending on shape, size, scale, and whatnot. That is, a glass is a transparent container in a vertical dimension, and it's actually, it has a kind of a contact relationship to this horizontal ground. So the figure is on the ground. And in Dene, you need a specific verb encoding this object versus, for example, this object, right? Or let me give you a different example. This here is a master thesis I'm just reading. This would be a plural object, right? Versus a singular flat object. This is encoded in the verb system. And you find this also in other Athabascan languages. Navajo has a dictionary, I think 500 pages, just classificatory verb systems. So it consists of additional prefixes, and these make up the lexical entry. So we have a stem, And we have a number of thematic prefixes, including the verb base, plus morphemes combining to a specific meaning, construction or collocation. And the verbal complex can be composed of, again, the stem and up to 10 prefixes. And a template would look like this. Most of the time, I've focused on the verb stem to the right and the postposition to the left in the adverb system. And in the Athabascan literature, you call this the disjunct zone and the conjunct zone and the stem zone. Just to give you a very brief intro to the linguistic aspects here. Okay, how do you orient yourself in Dene Chipewyan? Well, it's based on environmental landmarks, but additional use of cardinal systems. So I don't know how much you know about orientation, let's say, in the Inuit cultures based on different snow structures, winds, etc. Similar encoding patterns you find here. The Dene territory was strictly limited by water systems and prairies, large streams, numerous lakes, but also the extensive swamps, prairies, barrens, and forests. And in addition, you have those cardinal systems. So this is the absolute system, basically. This has been taken in Cold Lake. You can see the vast area. This is me back in the days, 2003, I guess. I had long hair back then, sorry to say. But you can tell already, okay, how do you orient yourself and what do toponyms do here? What I did is I asked speakers, how do you orient yourself in these environments? And it turned out they have a very dense system of toponyms that do work basically as a compass system. I'll give you some examples here. Note, most of those terms younger speakers nowadays wouldn't know. Younger speakers means speakers my age. And I wouldn't say that I'm that old, but I am already old enough not to know Dene as my mother language anymore, right? So if I would be a Dene speaker, that's because of what I kind of said implicitly. Speakers were sent to residential schools. They were not allowed to speak Dene Chipewyan. They had to speak French in the East or English, and they were punished speaking their first language. And that actually led to the language loss. I published on that as well, but Celirise even more. Now, a number of examples. Kesharene Hutine with the first one, downstream they dwell, I've shown this already. Kaithele ke Hutine, willow flat country up they dwell. And then if you go trying to analyze, it means this region is centering about the western end of Athabasca Lake at Fort Chipewyan and extending northward to Fort Smith on Slavey River and southward to Fort McMurray on Athabascan River. And for speakers, this knowledge is very clear and straightforward. They know exactly how to orient themselves. For us, this is very difficult to really understand, but that's, of course, very simple to explain, right? This is a certain tradition, and a tradition that has been a practice for generations, right? Kesie Hutine, Aspen House they dwell, encodes a place near the head of the Church River system. And you remember what I did show you, this kind of map A through D. You can just add this information. It's getting more and more detailed, right? This kind of map idea. Some more examples here. Again, you get these examples in doing these interviews and video recordings. You just walk around with speakers across the lake and you ask them about the stories, the myth, basically. How do you go hunting? How do you build a canoe and whatnot, right? Hasel Hutine, lowland they dwell, the region of Reindeer Lake, draining southward into Churchill River. Why is this important? Well, reindeer and of course moose or game were of specific interest in terms of hunting. So you see Dene, the sun under the eastern question mark, people, the barrens between Reindeer Lake, Hudson Bay, and Chesterfield Inlet. And you can just go on basically. Dene, dog flank people, these are the dog rib people, kind of enemies between Great Slavey, Great Bear Lake, and La Matre and Coppermine River. So these are like historic toponyms, basically. and not used by younger speakers anymore. So they wouldn't know what to do with these. Hence, certain knowledge is actually already lost, right? And since this is an oral culture, it is lost for good. I want to make life more complicated. I'll show you two tables. Sister languages, basically, I'll make it short here, but you see Koyukon, Hoopa, and Navajo, and you can already tell that the affixes used, right, are really specifying up above, down above, upstream, downstream, and whatnot. You see this to the left, right, for Koyukon. For Hoopa, again, upstream, downstream, away from the stream, toward the stream, downhill, right? Very specific in the morphosyntax of the specific language or respective language. Same goes for Navajo. And since I guess that you'll find the presentation as a PDF later on, you can just reread this and just go through the two tables I'm presenting here. This one is Tlingit and Carrier. Again, sister language to Dene Chipewyan. You find the affixes, and then you find some English equivalents, right? Up above, down below, upstream, downstream. Downstream here in Tlingit means north to south, right? Upstream, north to east. So it's a very fixed position in this absolute system. In Carrier, basically the same. You have underneath, upstream, away from, downstream, right? And if you go into the research by the Max Planck, especially the books plural from Levinson 2003 and Levinson Wilkins 2006, Grammars of Space, you find, let's say, delta where people actually orient themselves according to the slope of a hill, right? So a very specific toponym system. And I actually summarized this in a book in 2015. Yeah, that's a couple of years ago. Let's go to Epo or Eipomek. Mek is already in the name Eipomek because, as you can tell here, it means water, actually. So it's one of the crucial toponyms used for a cognitive map or cognitive sketch for orientation. Now, again, you remember I did show you the mountains in the beginning. So you are with the speakers in the mountains, and they know exactly where they are, right? And they know every detail, every rock, every tree, every bush has its own, basically its own name, its own function. And I call this here Toponyms in the Wild. This is going back to a very interesting book. It's called Cognition in the Wild by Ed Hutchins from 1995, How to Navigate without Nautical Instruments, right? And this picture has been taken by Wolf, chief. Some examples, and then I'll slowly come to an end. I'll just give you some examples how Epo speakers parse up basically their environment, right? Based on the Mek term, headwater region, downstream, water surface, and whatnot. And it's very specific. The English translation doesn't do really the degree of specificity. So you just have to bear with me here that for the speakers, this is very precise what it means. It wouldn't be precise for me. If I say in Hamburg, Elbabwärts, that is our river Elbe, it gives me an idea of direction. That's basically it. It doesn't really, it's not detailed enough. Same here, we have different idea of reddish brown color. There's a certain reason why it's reddish. Of course, lake, pond, bridge, riverbank. The riverbank is very specific. Where can you cross the river, basically? If you take the wrong river, basically, a path to cross the river, basically, you might be lost. A border of a brook, river shore along the river, etc. So you can tell how the river system is really important in the name-giving structures. Mountain is also, of course, obviously very important. We'll talk the top of the mountain, flank of the mountain, mountain top ridge, etc. This is not really surprising. If you go to south of Germany, you live in the Alps, of course, you do basically the same, right? Except that this is an oral tradition where you really pass this knowledge to the next generation in this kind of oral tradition. Some more examples. Again, this is based on the myth collected by Volker Haschen specifically. Very often you have these kind of sacred places which Women, for example, are not allowed to enter, and also vice versa. Certain places men are not allowed to actually walk in. And these, again, are very specific toponyms, and they have a very specific matrix. And for us, it's sometimes very difficult to parse this into, how should I put it, into this Western idea of, for example, orientation. Yes. So I'm basically at the end of the presentation. I have a couple of general comments I'd like to share here. I just presented very briefly two cultures and two linguistic systems, and clearly, not any surprise, I guess, speakers do parse their environment into a dense topography or spatial matrix based on toponyms and frames of reference. And this is represented in the language systems via a detailed coordinate system of landmarks, such as mountains, rivers, place names, and coded as toponyms, right? And lakes and rocks and trees and what not. Also, of such components include anthropological and cultural aspects of the language and beyond, again, these semiotic practices I talked about. And the interrelation of culture, environment, and language is evident in constructing cognitive sketches as intersections for cross-modal input. As I've stated before, it is always interesting, I think, coming from my perspective, I'm asking about geometry, I'm asking about specifics in spatial orientation, and then there's this short moment of hesitation by speakers, but basically it's me not being able to transmit what I'm actually asking for, right? Because I'm expecting a certain Western ideas based on actually visual perception, and this is not really universal, I'd say. And I think this is basically it. And yes, it is. Thank you so much for listening. And of course, I'm happy to hear your comments and questions. Just a side note, I said it in the beginning. The project I work on in Rome is different because it's really focused on toponyms in Latin and the Renaissance, and it's maybe easier to handle because you really have this material based on maps and text. Here, it is more this kind of elicitation. I am interested in, and how people basically use toponyms to orient themselves. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, thank you for the fascinating lecture. I think all of us are now thinking about or have many questions in our head. I would like to just start this discussion perhaps with maybe a comment from my own research on place naming, place names. The two societies you have introduced are originally non-literate societies, and certainly research in such a context is challenging in many ways and also illuminating in many ways. But I guess I personally may hesitate to draw a strict contrast between, let's say, Czech society and Dene Chipewyan, because yes, there are written toponyms on maps in official records, but when you do research, let's say in like where in the areas where I did my research, in the mountains or anywhere, there's many micro toponyms that have never been written down. They're only passed on orally, and they present a very rich tradition that is very similar to what you studied in many ways, although certainly the general support, grammars, vocabularies are perhaps there, whereas you would have to create them first in this more remote or more exotic context. But I think what I'm saying, this is not a criticism, but rather in support of what you're saying, that although you have talked about exotic, perhaps from our perspective, exotic situations, many of your findings can be directly taken to our context or European context and studied there as well, and maybe in a comparative study. So thank you.
May I just agree wholeheartedly, because I refrain from saying exotic, and you said it yourself. It's because from our perspective, it seems to be at least different. You were right in what you said, 100%. There was a presentation I did a couple of years ago, and Raphael Bertele, he did his habilitation on people in the Alps, in Switzerland, Germany, and parts of Italy. And he basically surveyed dialects and regionalects, and he basically said exactly what you said. Bottom line was, you don't have to travel to Canada. You find these dense systems in the mountains as well. And of course, it's actually, I would put it, as you said, and more positively, it's actually, we have a richer data set across different populations and cultures, regionalects, socialects, and whatnot, and we can see what's culture specific and what might be universal, right? And of course, the latter, I'm very careful to say anything about in terms of, I don't have enough data, of course, not at all, in terms of any kind of a statement in that direction. So yes, you're completely right. Thank you for commenting on that part. The Habilitation Ort und Weg is unfortunately for some of us maybe in German, but Raphael Bertele did a brilliant work, 2006 it is. Yes, so thanks for that comment. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, and now we have the time for questions. Is anyone ready to pose a question? I don't see any raised hands. Okay, please, Valeriu Nikita. I'm not sure if I'm...
Yeah, hello. I'm Valeriu Nikitian from the Technical University of Cluj-Napoca. I'm not specialized in native studies, the studies of languages in native languages in North America, but I would consider very interesting. I don't even know if it's a question or I'm just speaking my mind here, but I would consider very interesting making a comparison in such toponymical systems with peoples, with tribes like the Cherokee Nation, which was divided into two main branches. One branch, I guess a smaller one, that managed to remain in their original place, where they had evolved before European intervention in North Carolina.
Yep.
But then, as you know, America, the United States gained more and more territory. They moved such tribes more and more to the west until they surrounded them, and the only free territory for natives was Oklahoma, which I believe was the last state to be admitted, except Alaska and Hawaii. Yeah, so this is where I find things interesting. How quickly such tribes adapted their topographical knowledge to their new homes, and it was partly also based on racism and a sense of superiority from the colonizers, because they said, well, your home here in North Carolina, but your home over there in Oklahoma, this is your new home. We don't care. You're the same all over North America, or something like that, And yeah, this is where I've wanted to reach with my thoughts. It would be a very interesting situation to compare the topographical system, the toponymy of the Cherokee in North Carolina and those in Oklahoma. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, you do. Thanks so much. May I just before I answer, thanks for the comment in the chat. Thank you so much. And of course, I'm happy to read that the spatial stuff is interesting. This is actually back in the days. I worked with Chris Copes. He was at Rice University. He worked on Cherokee specifically. And let me kind of depart it. But we had a paper on classificatory verbs and the differences we tried to figure out what are the similarities to Athabascan verb stems, quite some distance, and in Cherokee. And of course, what you just said is a brilliant and interesting example. Just to make sure one thing, going back to the EPO for just a second, as I said, until the late 1980s, actually, you just got there by parachuting, if at all. And they were called Neolithic people. I don't like the term, but basically they just had just one tool, no electricity and whatnot, what we call modern technologies. Again, it's a term which is, from my Western perspective, I don't like it, but I guess you get the idea. One generation later, most of them are studying in Jakarta computational sciences. So the thing is, in a decade, basically, from living in the, 4,000 meter across sea level, above sea, above sea level, 10 years later, all of them basically, not all of them, that's not right, but a serious number of young students start in Jakarta studying computational science, for example. Right now, that means in the 1980s, early beginning of the 80s, they didn't know what a computer is, and nowadays it's kind of a given. That is, you can tell this kind of, going back to Piaget, accommodation, assimilation, and equilibration of information is like that quickly. So you made a very good point. I didn't do any more work on Cherokee since then, so it seems to me an interesting case to compare. The only problem I have right now, and it's not a problem, that is the Dene speakers, as I said, my generation, I guess I'm around 50 years old, right? I don't feel I'm that old, but I would be considered a young generation. Yeah, lucky me. They speak Dene basically as a second language. And that is, the data is quite different from the elder generation. And that what I'm trying to say here is, I don't really know what I'm dealing with. It's kind of an intermediate language I'm dealing with, actually. So this is one of my major, and that's, I'm not saying it's a problem, but quite some information is already lost. And I focus more and more on, again, on those practices, that is hands-on hunting techniques. And it's less in the linguistic system, just because the younger generation, basically they don't speak Dene fluently, and that has quite some impact. So before I can even compare to Cherokee, there's quite some work to do in actually having, there's still not really a full-fledged grammar out there for Dene speak. There's one by Cook from 2004, but it comes from a more generative approach, which is fine, but I come more from the cognitive linguistic approach. So yeah, I get your point, and that's an interesting one. I don't know what's out there in terms of comparing different regional differences in one culture for whatever reasons. Yeah, don't know. But again, thanks for that interesting comment. That's something I have to look into, really. Yeah.
And thank you for your answer.
Okay, thank you for the question. Again, it seems to me that what Mr. Nikitian mentioned was kind of a natural experiment, although I do not want to disregard the trail of tears, suffering, all of that, the removal. But from a scientific perspective, it was a natural experiment, and we have the speakers of an identical language having to adapt to different environments and how that would affect. And I think if we look at what even in our Central European or European context, there have been many such natural experiments that have taken place, and there's a lot of material that we could potentially explore and see how languages interact with their environments, and to what extent environments influence similar adaptations in different languages and vice versa. So I think that's the Cherokee example is something that we can find in Europe quite a bit as well, because of the significant migration events that took place in the recent history of Europe.
Yeah.
Additional questions? I don't see any raised hands. Oh, okay, Kata, please. Oh,
Yes.
okay.
So thank you for your lecture. And I have the first question is there any gender differences in spatial and toponym knowledge or name awareness? Or did you use a kind of a sociolinguistic perspective there, or socio-onomastic perspective there?
Thank you for that one. To be honest, it's a yes and no. I didn't specifically, but it turned out that there are, especially in Dene, you differentiate between singular, dual, and plural. That's one thing. That's not that surprising, maybe, but that's one thing. You also differentiate between different distances. Okay. The gender aspect I did not consider, but I could revise basically the data I have and see what are the differences in the encoding patterns. Now, this would just work with the elder speakers again, because the youngest, if I'm honest, they translated basically from English to Dene in answering. So what they use is a Western concept already. You see, this is how why the data is kind of, how should I put, not tainted. This sounds like there's no pure language, but you get the idea, right? They even use English grammar and then translate to Dene, and then they don't find the right words basically, and then they go back to English or French, right? And for the EPO, I can just refer to the work by Wolf and Volker, because there are clearly differences you find just because of the structure in those huts, like the men houses, the women houses, and you find this clearly in the linguistic system as well. You know already by the morpheme, this is just a place for men, and this is just a morpheme, just a place for women. And that's completely sacred and completely, or has been, I should say, a place off limits for the other gender. Yeah. But again, this is not, I have to say this, repeat this, I'm really interested in the spatial orientation issues. And this, your question would be, and not disrespect, but this would be more a side effect of my elicitations, I have to admit.
Thank you. And another question, if I may. Do you know anything about the neurorepresentation of this kind of spatial knowledge, like in the brain of taxi drivers in London, the hippocampus is a kind of a bigger or more dense, or did you this kind of research? I don't know.
Do you know the
tricky.
No, I actually there's a documentary called Where Am I? Do you know this one?
No.
Oh, it's from the Canadian broadcast system. I could not hear. It's 1 GB. It's exactly that research on the hippocampus and the difference between cab drivers and bus drivers in London versus the Inuit versus. It's a great movie. I use it. It's a document. I use it for my intro to spatial cognition and new Wolffian stuff. I myself did not do any neurological tests for a very simple reason. You don't take these elder speakers to a hospital and put them in an fMRI, period. You don't really. They are 80 plus and you don't do this. They have to travel from Cold Lake to Edmonton, 350 kilometers. No, we didn't. We did psycholinguistic tests. So I could go into that direction, but these are mostly qualitative tools, less quantitative. That means not reaction times, no rapid eye movement. We did rapid eye movement tests, but not Dene speakers. Now, your question actually raises some other questions and comments I would make, and I try to focus or to keep myself focused. I have just to, okay. How much does it tell us if we do find differences in the different brain areas between different people different practices. For sure, if I work with paper or different tools on a daily basis, for sure, there is a different representational system, maybe even in the brain, but I would say in the whole body. I come from this idea by Trevor Marchand. He did a great video on YouTube called Intelligent Hand, 20 minutes long. I can just really, from 2016. And it's about novices starting working with wood. Now, do they have a representation of different qualities of wood and using a saw in the brain? Well, even if, how much does it tell us to handle the different tools and different objects? So what I'm trying to say, again, I know most of those experiments until actually, well, I guess last year on spatial orientation. And yes, there is, I mean, you know, the research on cognitive maps starting with Tolman in the 1930s, but I'm not too sure how much it tells me from my cognitive linguistic perspective and how people orient themselves. Even if I find neurological differences, this goes also to the question, of course, differences or not between women and men in terms of abstract thinking. You know, all this kind of research, and it depends on your point of view departure if you buy into this kind of research or not. Long story short, I'm very, how should I put it? I'm careful in those fMRI studies and what they do tell us. It seems that a cab driver in London indeed has a different orientation technique than the bus driver. Why? Because of daily different constructions. He has to take different turns. The bus driver basically follows his routes or her routes, and that basically is a more static cognitive map versus the cab driver. Yeah.
Thank you. And back to the gender differences. Sorry, I'm just really curious. Did you find differences? How many place names is known by a woman and by a man? Is there difference
there must,
the number of place names or?
That's a good question. I don't have an answer in terms of numbers, but what can I say? What I can say is, who was hunting, men or women? Men. How far are the enemies for the EPO? The enemies for the EPO were like 3 days travel across certain ridges. The women never joined. They stayed in the hut. Hunting techniques for the Dene. Who was hunting? Men. By default, and this is just an assumption, but I guess it's not a wrong assumption. By default, men had a different orientation technique A and maybe more toponyms than women. Now, women were basically transferring those myths and stories. So they were responsible for actually from one generation to the next. That will be a counter argument. I don't have any numbers, but you see already it's not that easy to answer. So right now I would say, men, and then I think about it, maybe not, because women stayed at home. They told the stories, the different generations in one hut. Men,
yes, even in Hungarian areas, there are differences between different villages. Yep. If the lifestyle of women and men are similar, their knowledge, the place name knowledge is quite similar. And if they do other kind of life, then there is a bigger difference.
Yeah, I would simply say, sorry, I know there's a raised hand, just a second.
Yes,
what I would say in terms of embodiment theories is distributed cognition, enacted cognition and whatnot. If you take someone working on a daily basis with different tools versus me just writing, he or she, of course, has a different actually procedural knowledge of these processes. He or she doesn't even explicitly knows what he or she is doing. Why? Because he or she is proficient in what he or she is doing, be it a technician or whatnot. Now, these are what I call practices. And I think this is an interesting field to really study in terms of cognitive anthropology, to see the differences between different crafts, for example, right? If you see how someone is actually baking bread on a daily basis, and I can't do this, he or she knows the different, the texture, the material, and he or she can tell this just by touching, right? This I can't. And you know the famous example why we are so much smarter than any robot. A robot cannot crack an egg properly. He can't, or it I should say, it can't separate between egg yolk and white. It can't do this. You know, this kind of doing this, you crack an egg and you try to separate those, you know this, right? A robot can't do this. We can. Hence, a robot is smarter in playing chess and Go, but it can't even do the simplest thing in bakery. Here we go. Again, Intelligent Hand, Trevor Marchand, 21 minutes on YouTube. Brilliant.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Kara, for the question. From my own research, I found that there were statistically significant differences between toponymic competence between men and women in my research. Also, I found that they used somewhat different frames of reference, but to evaluate the exact proportion of the influence of language, landscape, and social factors, that changes, I guess, from context to context.
Yep.
Professional occupation, farmers versus herders, for example.
Yep.
And etc. So there's many factors but certainly many. This is an impulse for research. I think there's a lot we don't know yet that's worthwhile investigating. And I would perhaps now invite Dr. Kerfoot, who has raised her hand. Please pose your question.
Thank you very much, Martin, for this talk. I'm not a linguist. I'm speaking as a geographer based in Canada, so perhaps that influences what my comment is or my question is. First of all, with the Dene examples, the examples you gave to me seem to refer to very large areas,
yep,
and perhaps rather vaguely defined areas. Like one was sort of the head of the Churchill River system, yep, which must be very unspecific.
Yep.
And I guess in those cases, I wouldn't really be surprised that that information is lost to younger people or
yes,
to younger Dene Chipewyan speaking people, because likely it's not part of their culture yes, today. They're not out on the land in this sort of same context.
Yep.
So that was sort of my first point. And then I was wondering, as the seasons are so different in that part of the Canadian Shield, let's say, or the landscape there, is there much difference in spatial reference when the conditions are wintry with ice on the lakes and the yep, rivers and the small ponds and everything, to the flowing water in the summer, and whether yep, that you found much distinction there? I think you were only perhaps focused on the Cold Lake area, which is too bad because, as you say, that's a bit destroyed there. But other parts of the Chipewyan area, it is so enormous.
Yep. Thank you for the comment, and you're perfectly right about that. Those very broad toponyms, and yes, this is just if at all the elder generation still knowing what kind of locations are opening mentally, if you even say those words in toponyms. So thanks for pointing that one out. And yes, I basically, as you said, just did research for about 4 years in Cold Lake. But trust me, it was quite some work to do using those different elicitation tools. It turned out that in winter, the Cold Lake, which for me is a lake I can't orient myself at all. I'm sorry to say, I'm from north of Germany. I have no idea. I had no idea, but they knew exactly where they were all the time. In summer, of course, being on the lake on a canoe, on a canoe, I guess. Is it on or in a canoe? Is it in a canoe? I don't know the right preposition here. I'm on the boat.
In a canoe.
All right, that's interesting in terms of container ship. Anyway, they knew exactly where to go, being on the river, and not just following the streams. They knew exactly where, for example, they kind of did this dead reckoning, which we know from sailing, following moose, for example, because the moose can smell human beings, so you have to take a detour to actually hunt them down. And they knew exactly, basically, I don't want to overdo this here, but rocks and trees were specific, and they had specific names, and they opened up specific mental maps. So while actually walking around or hunting, they could actually, oh, this is the tree, my ancestors, blah, blah, that did this, and that's the rock where this and that happened. And of course, I was stunned by that. And later on, walking around in Hamburg, of course, I can give you all my anecdotes from my teenager years in Hamburg, what happened at place A, B, and C. So my question turned out to be, what are the differences? Except that I might have said it was so exotic, and I don't like to use the term. So there is a clear difference, going back to your question, between orienting yourself on the prairies in summer versus on ice in winter. And there's a different vocabulary used by the elder generation. Again, the younger generation, nope. And yes, the Cold Lake, I have to say, is a very conservative dialect in a very, you might say, artificial environment these days, because they live in a trailer park. And you all might know what that means. And that brings me to one aspect I would like to at least raise here. It was very strange for me back then to do this research, because we traveled there, we did this research, we spent quite some money, but my question was always, what's the benefit for the speakers? And our benefit, and we said, well, we're trying to revitalize the language and the grammatical structures. But they said, especially the younger people, we want to have the same rights as Canadian people have these days. Now, this is kind of a downer, I know, but I made these experiences with speakers, but this is completely beyond your question. Sorry about that.
Okay. Okay. Thank you again for your question. We have another raised hand. Our colleague Nikita, please go on.
I'm sorry. Promise this is going to be my last intervention. Can you please give us the name of that documentary? Where Am I? Or
yep.
What is it called? I mean, it sounded very interesting.
It's called Where Am I? Funny enough, speaking of this linguistic relativity idea, new Wolfing approach, in German it's called Where Am I in English? And the German is just give me a second here. I can send the original. Hopefully I can do this. I have the documentary on my computer. It's again 1 GB, so I have to send it via WeTransfer or a Dropbox. Where am I in English, Canadian English? In German, Navi im Kopf. Navi means GPS in your head. And you see the framing here already, right? So where am I is quite different from Navi im Kopf, because Navi im Kopf imposes already this kind of GPS-like system you have in your head. And they actually, going back to one of the questions, you have those examples on cab drivers in London versus bus drivers. Again, Inuit, how they find their way, basically using the foot to basically feel the snow and the wind directions in their environment. So I can send to whoever is interested, I can send hopefully the document, of course, just for private use and whatnot. It was on CBC, but I think you can't find it anymore. Okay, thanks. I see something's going on here. Okay.
Okay, so it appears that we have the link now in the chat, thanks to James Butler. So thanks for sharing the link. Maybe if someone wants to contact Dr. Thiering regarding the movie more directly, then I think that's also a possibility. I don't see any raised hands, so I will just use this opportunity, and you think of questions in the meantime. I put in the chat an invitation for any one of you who would like to take part in a developing idea, research idea workshop, focusing on what Dr. Thiering has talked about, but in the European context principally, not exclusively, but principally in the European context. That is to look at how speakers of different European languages interpret this identical landscapes or similar landscapes, and what role language plays in the differences in landscape perception and interpretation. So it would be a comparative workshop, and comparative research maybe coming out of this workshop. I would like to organize this workshop later this year, ideally in person, but I understand that not everybody probably will be able to participate, so it may be a hybrid event. We will see how many people will be interested in joining, and how they would be available to come, whether in person or only online. So I put my contact information in the chat. Write me if you're interested, or if you know of someone who might also be interested. Speakers of different languages or researchers in different linguistic areas, especially in Europe, are welcome, but not necessarily, because I think this comparative, the view from outside Europe and seeing how things work in other contexts is also important, because we are looking not for differences, but also for, or not only for differences, but also for commonalities, what we share as humans or speakers of human languages. So that's just a comment. Feel free to contact me whenever you have a chance. And is there another question? I don't see any raised hands. Okay, Kata again, please go ahead.
Yes, it's related to our new project, because it's quite new for me, this kind of research. So how you use computer games for your research? Are you use virtual reality, or I don't know, with spatial or special tools? I don't know the names of
okay, I don't know how much
just
time
a screen.
Okay, first I want to show you one thing before I go into that. Oh, yes, I love to do so, but I want to show you one thing for, just give me a second here. I don't need that one. That's the one I just presented. I want to show one thing, and then I'll go directly into what you just asked me. Can you see this? I need a, okay, we don't need that part. This is, okay, can you see this? I need just a yes or no. Okay, so going back to toponyms, right? So going back to maps, that this is Italy, you take Portolano, as you might remember, Portolano basically a very imprecise based on seafarers' stories back in the days, right? So we started in Rome using different ontologies from coming from cognitive computation linguistics, and we started actually annotating place names, right? And it looks like this. So you take a map, all those dots are toponyms. Now, this you translate in your research and translate it to Dene Chipewyan or Eipomek, and then you get an idea how much information you get and how dense and detailed it can get, actually. I think this is really, really interesting to do. The only problem here, Latin works not semi-automatic, so there's quite some manual work you have to do. And what we did in Rome since 2016, we compared different maps and how the toponyms actually change and what they covered and what not. I just wanted to give you this kind of research background, and you can tell, you take a current map and then you translate from the old toponyms to current toponyms and see how they have changed, the names have changed, the places have changed. I just wanted to show off here, and this is one of the CSV tables we use. So this was my showing off part. I don't know if I can really use this on the data I have from Dene and Eipomek, because this is much more data here. Now, going back to your question, if I may, let me just a second here. I was just in, as you remember, some of you at least, I was at a conference, first conference in situ last week. And I wanted to show you basically going exactly to your question. So what I'll do is, here we go. Just a second here. Need to do this. Just a second, please. You shouldn't have asked that question, but I don't know how I can be brief here. Okay, can you see this? All right. I'm starting with Escher's possible world, basically. And I have emotional language actually interact. But what I do is, I'll give you the starting point. Sorry for this. Yeah, here we go. This was my first slide. This is the computer game. You have a maze you have to find in this game called Antechamber, which is a puzzle. And here we go now. I give you just an idea. And you can ask yourself, how do you orient yourself in this game environment? It's not a shooter, apparently. You have different riddles, very simple geometries, really very simple. And the question is, how do you make sense in such an environment? So the problem-solving processes. And going back to your question, the VR step would be the next one, right? To really wear those goggles and do this. And I do this in an experiment in Berlin right now with a philosopher. So you see here these riddles, you click them, failing to succeed does not mean failing to progress. So you go around very simple hodological pathway and viewpoint and perspective, go straight on. Another riddle, some paths are others different than others. Now here you have to choose going left to right. And the fun part is there's no solution. You can do this over and over again. In terms of logic and geometry, there's no solution. So you take different perspectives, there are different frames of reference, but the only way out here is to turn around 180 degrees and go back, basically, right? Now I shall stop here. The game is getting more and more tricky, and it's actually against spatial logic very often. So it's kind of an impossible world according to Escher. So I'll stop it here because this is a different presentation. These are all the riddles. When you finish the game, you have this whole black wall at the beginning. You have all the riddles collected. And then you have different rooms here to the right. You see a certain portal gun where you actually collect cubes. I'll finish here because this is a different presentation. Now, and I really, really like this topic because it asks about multimodality and mediality. How do we orient ourselves in these games? This kind of an indie game. It's not really known to many players. Some other games I'm comparing this with is Echochrome, a Manifold Garden, Disoriented. Very simple Escher-like games. And this is what I really think is interesting with respect to spatial orientation. Next step is we had a first try with participants playing the game, and one was playing the game with a keyboard, and she was actually verbalizing, and the other one had to redo the wayfinding process in a different room, basically. So we go in these directions. And now you can, hopefully you can see now, there's one connection to the Dene Chipewyan work, that is the whole idea of spatial frames of reference. How do these people orient themselves in these environments? How do these environments affect spatial cognition? And now I take a computer game environment. Are there any similarities or are there any differences? And what are the differences based on Euclidean geometry, based on visual and perception, action and perception and whatnot? Don't get me started going that direction because I really like this. I'm so fascinated about these games these days. I mean, I've been playing these games. The first one was Pong, 1979, those white things, playing table tennis. But that's, I started with a C64 and VC20, but this is going back in the days. Sorry, I didn't really answer your question, but I really, this is quite a different presentation. But I'm using also toponyms here, landmarks, frames of reference, spatial prepositions, posture verbs, and whatnot. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sounds exciting. Yeah.
Oh, that it is really, seriously, it is, because most of the students don't know those games. I mean, they know first-person shooter games, of course, Doom, Assassin's Creed, Half-Life, Hunt, and whatnot. But most of them don't know these games. They're actually bored because there's no timeline. You do see a clock in the beginning, but the clock doesn't mean anything. So you have all the time in the world, basically. And if you're a skilled player, I think there was a fast run 18 minutes, but I think average is about 2.5 hours. But it's actually about 6 hours doing this whole maze. And the maze, you can just see at the end, and you take, from the hodological perspective, again, Hodo's path, you take a bird's eye perspective, right? And this is, you might know this as well in different cultures. Do all cultures have a bird's eye perspective? And perspective is a fairly new technique from the Renaissance, right? So these are questions I'm really interested in. And yeah, I'm fascinated by those games, I have to say. Simple environments, but not simple at all. Sorry, I'm getting carried away here.
Thank you.
No, I think we all appreciate your enthusiasm, and I hope it is contagious. And we'll bring it back home with us today. Please, there's another question, James Butler.
No, thank you very much. I just wanted to build on what you were just saying, Martin, and building on Kathleen's idea. Many years ago, 2014, I published a paper, just a very personal study, a very small scale study, looking at how people navigated an unfamiliar environment in Minecraft. And
yeah, nice.
They created names to help them navigate. Since then, I have been working with a colleague at Lancaster University to develop a program called LitCraft, which is adapting literary texts, specifically those literary texts which have maps, such as Treasure Island, Robinson Crusoe, Swiss Family Robinson, into the game. And we're doing, and we've just applied to Leverhulme Trust for a 3-year project looking at the interspatiality of maps, text, and virtual representations. And again, that's something I might just send you both an email after this, if I may. Just,
yes, please do so. Yes, please do so.
But no, just when you were talking about the navigation and how people perceive versus what they perhaps expect, and how they navigate, it was just, no, it's fantastic. Yes, I would like to get in touch, if I may, with you both.
You're more than welcome. And the thing is, I haven't said it. I mean, originally, I'm actually a philosopher. So I'm a philosopher of spatial concepts. This is I guess my hobby. What I really think is interesting is these games really are hands-on interest in terms of spatial concepts, right? I mean, Stefan Günzel, I work with him at the Technical University in Berlin. He did his habilitation on ego shooters in 2012, and showing how these different topologies and Alhora and Topos work differently in those games. And he really takes computer games to a different level, I think, as a scientific object, really, and not just going back to the Columbine massacre as a means to get kids killing other people, right? That was the big discussion in Germany, actually, and I guess, well, and I know in different other countries as well. I really think, and I mean, this is so fascinating because you mentioned already maps and of course compass system in those games, right? I mean, how do they affect spatial cognition? Do we really use them as players explicitly? How do they affect spatial, again, viewpoint and perspective and whatnot? I think these are really fascinating topics, and you can show them not just easily, but you can really do nice work with these computer games. And again, Antichamber it seems very simple, but it's not. It uses a very simple Euclidean geometry, but it's really, really not that simple at all. And not just talking about the problem solving processes. And if you play Manifold Garden, I don't know if you ever played it. If you don't care about playing, just go on YouTube, take a Let's Play Manifold Garden. If you watch Matrix in 1999 or Inception, this is beyond those means. Or even if you watch Dune, which got all these Oscars for whatever reason, I don't know why, because it's just effect. Great sounds, great pictures, no story, but that's okay. That's just me being very negative here. Those games I think are really interesting. And again, if you ask like these more philosophical questions, how does spatial orientation work based on different semiotic practices? So what is similar in hunting versus problem solving in a computer game like Antichamber? Or can we even compare those at all? I'd say yes. And because spatial frames of reference, for example, are one example. And then going back to one of your comments, absolute frames of reference are supposed to be not used in the German system, for example, but they are used in these computer games. And that is interesting. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting carried away here.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you for the question and answer. Kata, how do you see it? Do we still have time, or should we maybe wrap up? I don't see any more raised hands, but what do you think?
I think we can close this session.
Okay. So, well, let me first just comment briefly. Thank you very much, Dr. Thiering, for very illuminating and interesting talk. A lot of impulses for us to think about how we can maybe take over some of your ideas or research findings and apply them in our own research. I hope we will be perhaps in touch in some way, one way or another, to look at how our research findings compare and what we can take out of them in terms of a general understanding of the role of language in environmental perception. And this game approach to studying language and cognition is a very fascinating topic that to me is a terra incognita that I have to first familiarize myself with better, but certainly an intriguing idea. Thank you all for taking part and asking questions. I will let Katalin Resegi close up from her perspective, and there's some raised hands. Well, certainly Dr. Thiering, but I'll let Kata then to wrap up. Thank you all.
Yes, just 2 sentences. It was a real fun. Thank you. And I just would like to talk about our next speaker, who will be Kimberly Klassen, who will talk about proponyms from a psycholinguistic perspective. So it's another one again, and the title of her lecture is The Lexical Load of Proponyms for Second Language Readers of English. And it will be on a Monday in April. I forgot the date, but in April.
Monday, 11th, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, maybe. Thank you, Lester. So thank you again. It was really exciting. And I think we can close this event.
Dr. Thiering, did you want to say anything
it was
at the end?
I'd like to take the stage energy from Ron Lanneker, going back to Phenomenology by Merleau-Ponty. Thank you for sharing the stage basically with me here, and yeah, well, you had the chance to present more data. I listened back in the days, and going even into my new research. Thank you so much for the questions and comments and a nice atmosphere, I have to say. And now, of course, the attendance we don't like to listen to hear anymore. It would have been a pleasure to see you in situ, that is for real. But now you are real, because Zoom is the new reality, right? So, yep. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.